So what was the Prague Spring? Essentially, the Prague Spring refers to a set of reforms introduced in Czechoslovakia in 1968, which at the time was part of the USSR. In this video, we'll go over the background, reforms, events, and consequences of the Prague Spring. Without further ado, let's get into it. Since 1948, Czechoslovakia had been a model satellite state, and the standard of living was higher. The leader had been Antonin Novotny since 1937. Novotny was an unpopular, hard-line communist and was slow to follow Khrushchev's policy of de-Stalinization, which involved a moving away from a totalitarian state and more towards the traditional values of communism. The Czechoslovakian economy was in a serious decline throughout the 1960s, as the USSR forced Czechoslovakian industry to produce materials, such as steel, for the Soviet economy. The USSR also prevented Czech factories from producing consumer goods. Novotny's attempts at reform after 1965, known as the New Economic Model, were unsuccessful, since they produced a surplus of consumer goods few people could afford. As a result, many Czechs demanded greater democracy. In October 1967, a number of reformers, including Alexander Dubček, challenged Novotny's leadership at the Central Committee of the Communist Party meeting. Dubček invited Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, to Prague. Brezhnev was surprised at how unpopular Novotny had become and withheld support from him. On the 5th of January 1968, Novotny was replaced by Dubček as first secretary of the Communist Party, supported by Brezhnev. In March, Novotny resigned as president and was replaced by General Ludwig, who supported Dubček's reform program. Novotny had been removed from the two most powerful positions in the country. Dubček was a committed communist, but believed communism didn't have to be as restrictive as it was. He agreed to introduce reforms which would provide socialism with a human face. These included less censorship, more freedom of speech, legislation of political opposition groups, meaning groups that weren't communist, more trade with the West, and a reduction in the activities of the secret police. These reforms were introduced in April 1968 and led to a greater feeling of hope among the population. This became known as the Prague Spring. Dubček affirmed Czechoslovakia would remain in the Warsaw Pact and Comecon, but these reassurances were not enough to prevent a Soviet invasion. Dubček's reforms began to worry the Soviets, because although he claimed to be a committed communist, Dubček proposed allowing non-communist political parties to be set up and to be put up candidates for election. Also, Dubček said that Czechoslovakia would remain in the Warsaw Pact, but then welcomed Marshal Tito, the president of Yugoslavia at the time, to Prague. This was problematic, as Yugoslavia had been communist since World War II, however was not a member of the Warsaw Plan, and Moscow was very wary of Marshal Tito. The Soviets had to respond to this by sending 52 KGB officials to Prague airport, who then took over the control tower so they could help land airborne divisions of Warsaw Pact forces. Most of the troops and tanks were sent by the USSR, although 5 members of the Warsaw Pact contributed. Due to the Soviet Union blocking NATO radar stations in West Germany, the large number of troops arriving came as a surprise to everyone. Worried that Czechoslovakia was slipping from his grasp, the Soviet leader, Brezhnev, declared that the USSR would not allow the countries of Eastern Europe to reject communism, as he stated, even if it meant a Third World War. This became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. The USSR feared liberal ideas would spread to other European states, causing instability and threatening the security of the Soviet Union. They also feared that growing trade links between Czechoslovakia and West Germany would lead to an increase in Eastern Europe. Czechoslovakia had the strongest industry in the Eastern Bloc. This made it incredibly valuable to the USSR. Faced with an invasion force of 500,000 troops, the Czech government realized that the resistance was futile and appealed to the population to act with restraint and to be peaceful. This became known as passive resistance. This included standing in front of tanks and offering flowers to soldiers. On the 16th of January, 1969, Jan Palach, a student activist, burnt himself alive on the top of the Prague's Wenceslas Square. He died 3 days later. There was no popular uprising. Instead, the people refused to cooperate with the Soviet troops and jeered and chanted at the invaders, daubing walls with anti-Soviet slogans and painted out all signposts except for those pointing to Moscow. The Prague Spring quickly came to an end. Dubček was arrested and taken to Moscow. The pro-Soviet Gustav Husak was installed as the Czech leader to be Brezhnev's servant. He reversed Dubček's reforms, and Czechoslovakia remained a communist country inside the Warsaw Pact. As with Hungary in 1956, the Western powers did nothing to actively support the Czechs in their Prague Spring. The USA accepted that the Soviets were taking this action in their own sphere of influence. The American reaction was comparatively mild, chiefly because the USA and its leadership were more focused on the worsening situation with the Vietnam War. US-Soviet relations had been easing, and President Lyndon Johnson did not want to provoke Moscow. The USA believed that if they acted behind the Iron Curtain, the USSR would see support to Czechoslovakia as an act of war. Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and East Germany had agreed to help the USSR, so America would have been surrounded in Czechoslovakia had they sent support. There was widespread international criticism of Moscow's actions in Czechoslovakia. In the United Nations, a number of countries voted for a resolution condemning the Soviet intervention, though the resolution failed because of the USSR's veto. The revival of traditional Cold War tactics was a setback for improving international relations. Relations deteriorated further as both the USA and USSR continued to stockpile their conventional weapons. The Brezhnev Doctrine seemed to bring an end to peaceful coexistence. It led to greater Soviet control of the members in the Warsaw Pact. So, in conclusion, the people of Czechoslovakia demanded a more democratic society. This was often referred to as socialism with a human face by Dubček, who introduced the reforms. This meant keeping the socialist model of government, but guaranteeing a better delivery of goods, services, and freedoms to the Czech people. This attempt lasted for 4 months until it was crushed by the Soviet Red Army.